Welcome everyone to our webinar on lessons from the U.S. Labor Party for working class politics today. We're really excited. We have more than 1,000 people registered for the event from unions and organizations across the country. So we're super jazzed by the level of interest and really excited to dive into the conversation. Just before we start, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors. We're sponsored by the DSA National Labor Commission, the Rank and File Project, the United Auto Workers Region 9A, the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America, and the Socialist Register. I'm Steve Marr. I'm going to be moderating the event tonight. I'm the co-editor of the Socialist Register and an assistant professor of economics at SUNY Cortland. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that we have a brand new Socialist Register volume hot off the presses that deals with left strategy in the wake of the closure of the Sanders and Corbyn moment following the defeats of Syriza, Blocko, Podemos, and even the crisis of Dalinka, as well as dealing with issues across the global south and the end of the pink tide. So it's very relevant to our discussion today as the consolidation within the Democratic Party by the centrists, Biden and Harris, following the defeat of Bernie, and the failure of the Democratic Party to offer an alternative, a working class alternative to MAGA politics, is primarily what made organizing a discussion around what an alternative might look like and how to think about it seriously made it seem so pressing. We also compiled a reader of different documents and a couple articles related to the Labor Party, which was sent out as part of the Eventbrite email that you received. It's worth taking a look at those documents if you haven't done so already. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have Carl Rosen, General President of the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America, and a former participant in Labor Party organizing. He was on the Electoral Committee. We have Jenny Brown, who was a co-chair of the Labor Party Organizing Committee in Gainesville, Florida for 10 years, and is currently assistant editor of Labor Notes. We have Howard Botwinick, who's a retired associate professor of economics at SUNY Cortland, former vice chair of the New York Labor Party, and a member of the program committee. He's going to be addressing that in just a second. And finally, we have Mark Dudzic, a longtime union activist and a member of a former national organizer of the Labor Party and a current chair of the Labor Campaign for Single-Payer Healthcare. So welcome to all our panelists. This is going to be a really, really great discussion. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over now to Mark, who's going to give us a little background before we begin the discussion. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. I'm going to try to give you a 5-minute history of late 20th century neoliberalism. So listen up closely here. So the Labor Party came together in the mid 1990s, and it was coming out of this rise of neoliberalism, which started in the late 1970s. Under Jimmy Carter, and then just really massively accelerated when Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, with massive attacks on both workers' organizations and standards of living and social standards and provisions for working people in this country. The firing of striking air traffic controllers by President Reagan in 1981 triggered an orgy of union busting that swept through basic industry and the public sector, and really, made it virtually suicidal in many instances to go out on strike. So we lost the biggest and best weapon that we could have, or had it severely compromised. And this was also the era when globalization really took root. Neoliberal globalization, which is massive mobility for capital and minimal rights for workers, and the implications of that. And we were dealing with figures like Albert Dunlop, who was called Chainsaw Al, and Frank Lorenzo, who drove 2 unionized airlines into bankruptcy. I think he drove into bankruptcy twice. So, and my favorite, and the UE will remember this guy, Jack Welch, the GE president, who famously boasted that if he had it his way, he would have all of his factories on a barge, and he would tow them to wherever the labor costs were cheapest. And that was sort of what workers were really experiencing. And, the complete inability to initially respond to this crisis, not unlike, kind of like what the Democratic Party is dealing with in the first 30 days of the Trump administration. All of this stuff is hitting us, and people really were completely unprepared to respond to it. So the initial labor union sort of analysis of this situation was that we were under a regime called Reaganism that was a uniquely kind of reactionary brand of republicanism, and that what we really need to do is kind of rebuild and restructure and relaunch the Democratic Party. And we did just that. In 1992, we elected a guy named Bill Clinton as president, and we did that with intensive labor engagement and labor support. He wasn't the first choice of a lot of the unions, but they almost all lined up behind this guy. And we had high expectations coming out of that election. We thought that a lot of this stuff was going to stop. There was promise of labor law reform and a whole series of other things. But we were met with numerous and increasingly escalating betrayals under the Clinton administration, beginning with an abandonment of any pretense of support for labor law reform, a totally botched corporate-oriented healthcare reform that ended up going into the toilet in the end, and making healthcare reform, taking it off the table for another 15 years. An attempt to eliminate the few remaining rights that poor and unemployed workers had to social support, called so-called welfare reform. Mass incarceration began under the Clintons, under Bill Clinton. And then the topper of all toppers for many workers was the passage of the NAFTA agreement, which really sort of institutionalized the rules of globalization for working people. And workers immediately understood that this was going to destroy what remaining bargaining power they had and what remaining economic security they had. And it could only have been passed by a Democratic president, because they needed to marshal a few extra Democratic votes in order to get it over the top. They had been trying to do this for quite a while. And so the outrage and the anger was really, boiling at the surface within the labor movement and other movements. And, the other thing that emerged, particularly during the Clinton era, is this idea that originated in England under Margaret Thatcher, that there is no alternative, that, no matter what, the markets have to be fed, and, you're just going to have to accommodate yourself to these things. And Clintonism really, to me, really embodied that whole vision. So, we had this beginning to come together, a vision that that neoliberalism was more than just, an electoral deviation of a two-party system, that it was a new system, and that we were going to have to workers needed to think about how to resist under those terms and conditions. And in the early 90s throughout the 90s, there were a series of long and protracted strikes and lockouts that often drew widespread support and solidarity from around the labor movement and other social movements. And, strikes like the Pittston coal strike, where workers actually seized a coal facility and held it for, I think, a couple of weeks, and camped out in the thousands and in front of coal companies. And the Decatur, Illinois war zone, where there were 3 overlapping lockouts and strikes that took place, and National Guard troops on the streets for months, and thousands of unionists coming in and out. So there was all of this turmoil that began to come together, and people began to understand that we needed to build something new out of all of this. In 1995, new leadership was elected to lead the AFL-CIO in the only contested election of the AFL and the CIO. There was one contested election, and it was in 1995. And the New Direction folks came, saying that we're going to organize and we're going to develop a smart and strategic response to the rise of capital. And the plan was to organize 1 million new workers a year. We also had new leadership during this period in the Teamsters Union. Ron Carey, the largest union in the country, was, militant activist supported by Teamsters for a Democratic Union was elected in the Teamsters. Things began to really coalesce around the idea that the labor movement was beginning to strategically revitalize itself and build more power for itself. In addition, I think a couple of other factors that kind of played into the launching of the Labor Party initiative is the Cold War ended in the late 1980s, and the vicious anti-communism that characterized almost every segment of the labor movement except Brother Rosen's UE began to dissipate to some degree. People could talk to each other about ideas in ways that were verboten for many decades in the labor movement. These kind of things also helped kind of stir the pot. So my union was the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, which is now a part of the Steel Workers Union. We were lucky to have a legendary labor visionary named Tony Mazzocchi, who was always a significant national player in our union. And Tony got elected on a coalition slate in 1988 in my union. And part of the program of that slate was that the union would explore the possibility of independent labor politics. They actually kept their word on that issue. And, we developed an internal process within the OCAW. We began by surveying our own members, asking them what they felt about the two parties. And we found out, big surprise, that something like 60% of our members told us that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans represented the interests of working people, and the time had come to think about some new options. Based on that, we took that as the beginning of a mandate. We moved that through a series of discussions and resolutions at district council and other meetings. Then in the early 1990s, the union designated Tony Mazzocchi and gave him staff assistance and other resources to go out and talk to working people about the idea of organizing a labor-based political party. They sent this idea out into the world, and we launched an effort called Labor Party Advocates in 1991, which was exactly what its title said. We were people who were advocating for Labor Party, and there was a series of hundreds of meetings in union halls and union conventions and discussions and debates that kind of continued to build momentum. Everywhere we went, everywhere where we administered a survey, majorities of workers were told us they were fed up with both the Democrats and the Republicans. And we would go back to the leadership and show them that. A lot of leaders would tell you, oh, yeah, it's a good idea, but the members would never accept the idea of a labor party. So show them otherwise, and maybe we can move them. We did a cold mailing to 13,000 locals in the U.S. This is like a paper mailing. This is 1993 or so. Somehow we came across this mailing list, and we got this huge response from that. And out of that, pressure built to come together to launch the Labor Party at a 1996 convention, which I think Howard is going to kind of talk about with a little more detail. I just would like to say two more things about that. Number one, what was particularly unique to me in retrospect, looking back from today, about that convention was that the overwhelming majority, like well over 90% of the delegates at the founding convention were union members, and that most of them were elected or appointed by their union structure, whether it was a local union or a district council or whatever, to be there on behalf of that organization. And that's a very, that's significant in terms of trying to build a party like that. Secondly, this guy, Tony Mazzocchi, all throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, he died in 2003, he constantly would say, time and time again, he would say, we have got to build a party for working people. If we fail, workers will turn to an ugly fascist-oriented solution to their problems. We have to provide the structures and the narrative for workers to move, to change these things, or we will be dealing with fascism. Here we are today, brothers and sisters.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. Now we're going to hand it over to Howard, who's going to talk a bit about the platform that he was involved in crafting. Go ahead, Howard. You're muted, Howard.
I knew that would happen. Hi, everybody. So I just want to say one more thing about the convention so you get a sense of what this thing was, how significant it was. There were 1,300 delegates representing 9 international unions, 100 local and state labor bodies, and over 1.2 million organized workers that were represented at that meeting in Cleveland. So it really was quite something. I was part of the interim steering committee that began to move this thing from LPA to a Labor Party. And I had the honor of being on the program committee from its early stages all the way through to the final events at the convention. And the process of developing that program was a long one. It involved a lot of aspects of feedback from workers. Les Leopold and his Labor Institute developed a program called Corporate Power and the American Dream. And he led that discussion, and along with other LPA members, involving over 3,000 activists in 20 states. And that yielded hundreds of suggestions about what an economic agenda for working people might look like. And that was the beginning of starting to flesh out this economic program. Then Les Leopold, Adolph Reed, and I set to work to try to develop an 11-point program or so that we would present to union leaders as the beginning, as a draft. We got a lot of heat for some things, and we could talk about that later, but we revised it. We came up with a draft that brought us to the convention. And then we got there 4 days before the convention officially started, and we started working. There were 6 of us, I think, 5 or 6 of us from different unions, and we worked night and day. And it was the most, I can't tell you, it was the most rewarding experience I've ever had in terms of working with people who left their egos at the door, knew that we had to do this in a limited amount of time, and we went to work. And there were a lot of talented people involved in this, and we put together what I think is a really pretty damn good program. We had some rough spots, but we put it together and brought it to the floor. And then there was more debate. There was a debate about abortion that we can talk about later, I think would be interesting if there's time. Some of the members of the Black Caucus wanted some stronger statements about what was happening with the burning of Black churches at the time and some other things. And we incorporated a number of these things and brought it back to the convention. And then it eventually passed, and it was an incredibly exciting moment. And people were really thrilled to have that program. So I'm gonna, before I talk about the program itself, I want to urge you, because you have it now, read it in its entirety, because it really, although it was developed in 1996, it is as relevant today, in fact, maybe more so than it was then. And it is I think, a great basis to begin discussions about a lot of the issues of the day that are very important. Securing employment for all, the importance of the public sector, which is now under attack like it's never been attacked, a worker-oriented approach to trade policy, which I haven't really heard much about, but we had a really good program, I think, on that, universal health care, and many issues. In fact, I don't know if people know this, but a great deal of that program was incorporated into Bernie's program for his presidential campaign. when you see it, when you read it, you'll see that it is a thoroughly progressive program for economic justice, and it clearly recognizes that there's a profound conflict of interest between capital and labor. In that program, you will not find any references to win-win programs, which a lot of the AFL-CIO unions were engaging in at the time. No discussion of labor management cooperation schemes. Instead, the program preamble, which is very powerful, I think, concludes by saying the Labor Party understands that our struggle for democracy pits us against a corporate elite that will fight hard to retain its power and privileges. This is the struggle of our generation. The future of our children and their children hangs in the balance. It is a struggle we cannot afford to lose. And when they read that out, there was this big applause. People really were excited by that. I want to make a quick point about the debates about identity politics, class politics, which the left has been embroiled in for quite a while now. And I would argue that in contrast to the identity politics debates that have preoccupied the left, one could argue that the Labor Party's 16-point program actually contests the notion there are clear-cut divisions between issues of economic justice and other social issues, particularly around race and gender. A quick reading of the program reveals that important issues that truly speak to the needs of all sectors of the working class are comfortably woven into the Labor Party's entire program. Although there is no separate page on women's rights, feminists will find that most of the critical issues, such as comparable worth, protection against sexual harassment, paid family leave, and the right to choose, are presented under appropriate headings throughout the program. More importantly, perhaps, these issues are discussed within a context that should make sense to most working people as we struggle to unite around a program that empowers all of us. So we can talk maybe about the abortion thing later on, and I'm sure Jenny, who has written a lot about that, might want to be saying some things about that. So if you look over the program, the 16-point program, I'm just going to highlight a few things. It starts off very uniquely, I think, and this is due to Les Leopold and Tony Mazzocchi's initiative, with a argument that we should amend the Constitution to guarantee everyone a job at a livable wage. It says, first and foremost, everyone, both in the private and public sectors, needs a guarantee of a right to a job at a living wage, one that pays above poverty level wages and is indexed to inflation. In today's world, that comes to a minimum of about $10 an hour. $10. Remember, that was 1996, and people thought we were crazy. Some people did. The preamble to the Constitution promised to establish justice, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. But for working people, all this means nothing if we don't have the right to a job. So that really put us on the map with a very unique program to talk about job security. And then Les did a lot of work on how do we try to penalize corporations for laying off workers. He's still writing a lot about that. You might have read his book or some other things. And it says here, paid laid off workers should be paid 2 months severance for every year of service. So we wanted to really make it expensive for companies to lay off workers and then use that money to beef up their stock prices, which is going on so often here. Then there's, of course, the right to workers' rights, the restore the workers' rights to organize, bargain, and strike. And the one that I don't, tell me, Steve, am I supposed to finish this?
Yeah, I'd say wrap soon if you can, yeah.
Okay. I really would urge you is to read number 4, which is entitled End Bigotry, an injury to one is an injury to all. I think the wording, and I'm self-interested because I helped write it, but I think you'll find it really powerful and a very powerful way to integrate, again, the issues of discrimination into a workers' program for equal rights for everyone. We guarantee universal access to quality health care. And that in there, it included unimpeded access to a full range of family planning and reproductive services for men and women, including the right to continue or terminate a pregnancy. Then we have some innovative discussions about more time for family and community, protecting our families, quality public education for everyone, stop corporate abuse of trade. Again, I think that one, read that carefully. It's really a good response to Trump's version of rethinking trade. And I guess I'll leave it there. The
Great. Last
one, again, that's so germane to what's going on is the one on number 12, revitalize the public sector. It's under attack like it's never been in recent history. And I think, again, this is a great response to that explains the importance of the public sector to working people. I'm going to leave it there. Of course, we have the just transition movement to protect jobs and the environment, which was something that Tony Mazzocchi was involved in for most of his adult life and did path-breaking work with OSHA and other things. We'll leave it there. And
great. Thanks, Howard. And the full program is included in the reader that was sent out, the PDF that was sent out. So I also urge everyone to take a look at that in its entirety. We're now going to kind of move into the discussion, and we have a couple different sections. We're going to have a kind of free-flowing conversation to some extent, structured around different areas that we wanted to kind of get into. And the first of which is the relationship of the Labor Party to unions and the question of class political formation. So I kind of wanted to start off with the question of, how and why did you structure the Labor Party in the way that you did? And what was the strategic thinking behind the way that the Labor Party was organized and set up? And if you want to mention specifically Labor Party advocates as a part of that, if anybody wants to jump in on that question. Anyone? Go ahead, Mark, you're muted.
Sorry to talk so much, but I'll jump in and try to be quicker this time. So, I think we had a couple of ideas when we launched Labor Party Advocates. Idea number one was that a party of labor has to have labor at the table and participating from the very beginning. We can't kind of loop them in at a later date. That's not how it's going to work. You have to build that into the whole nature and the structure of the party. Then the second idea was that the participants must own the politics of the Labor Party. So we had this saying, I think Tony Mazzocchi initiated it. People would come and say, oh, we ought to do this, we ought to do that. And Tony would say, hey, if you can get that passed in your union hall, then you can come down here and we'll talk about it. So it was like, if you want to think about these politics, think about how you engage with working people around these politics and how you can move these issues. And that's how we're going to build this party from below, from the sort of felt concerns of working people. You can really construct a whole vision of how a just world ought to look. And I think that was really significant. And then again, just like in a union organizing drive, you build unity around what unites us first. And then, once you have that structure, then you can use the culture of solidarity that begins to emerge to really start engaging with workers on much more divisive and difficult issues. I mean, if you start with what divides us, as an organizer, I've never found that works. And I think we tried to implement that vision when we launched Labor Party Advocates as a kind of a style of work.
Thanks, Mark. Another issue is, there's this fundamental challenge, I think, of trying to organize this Labor Party within a labor movement that did not necessarily already have a class struggle orientation. So I was wondering, did you guys see it as part of your task to transform those unions? How did you balance between, challenging the unions, pushing the unions, and then accommodating the unions to keep them on board and to get them involved in the party? Jenny?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Labor Party was an attempt to deepen, broaden, and raise the expectations within the labor movement of what we could do. Because when you're in this situation where there's no political expression of working class interests out in the larger world, you become more narrow in your focus. As even if you're a visionary labor leader, what are you trying to promote? And you're basically limited to what you can win on the level of your workplace, while it's being undermined by the tides of corporate power, right? So you're in this trap. So in a way, the whole idea of the Labor Party was to have that vision out there that we could all see, okay, there's something beyond this defensive fight that we're fighting on our pensions and plant closings and all of the stuff that we were facing. It's just hard to conceptualize that without a political vehicle for labor. And I would say, I mean, the membership of the labor movement, which was at the time and is still the largest member-funded entities in our country, right? They have democratic structures. Many misuse them, but I would still argue that it's the most democratic part of our society. It's certainly more democratic than, 9 zillion grant-funded nonprofits that have no constituency at all. And so part of it is like building this vehicle to make it possible to have a broader vision for the labor movement as a whole. So I would say, and I noticed there was a quote from the bigotry plank of the program that explains this a little bit. Quote, politics is the process of defining what is a personal problem and what is a social problem. Racism used to be an individual problem dealt with by the person being discriminated against until the civil rights movement transformed it into a social problem through political action. Both political parties have been narrowing the political agenda and telling people that individual solutions are the answers to problems that affect everyone. This focus on the individual means everybody for themselves, and while Republicans and Democrats alike want us to believe that alone we can deal with power, we know we must unite. So this is kind of how we were approaching it. And there obviously there were unions that were not going to get on board immediately, but there were quite a few that did. And in particular at the level of the local, because Tony had been going around talking about the Labor Party idea for a very long time at this point. And Labor Party advocates had been around for 5 years. So as the Clinton betrayals came in and piled up, there was already a base of people who had heard this idea. So.
Yeah, and
Great. Go ahead, Carl. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Carl.
To that question, because the last part of what Jenny said was addressing one of your questions, Steve, which is, was it the Labor Party's task to transform the labor movement? I think we all felt that in the Labor Party doing its work, it would be transformational. But there was not only was there not an explicit task to go and try to transform unions, it was actually explicitly the reverse, that we were not going to go in and interfere with the internal workings of other unions because that was going to be problematic. But what we did is we structured the Labor Party so that unions could join at whatever level they were comfortable with. So in the case of my union or Tony Mazzachi's union, so UE, OCA, and a couple others, the national union came in and that brought with it all the locals and intermediate structures. But for the great majority of unions that were joining, they were doing it at the local level or at the district level. And you could come in and there were structures just for everybody who was operating at that level. You could also join as an individual member, very, very little say-so, because that's back to Mark's point. If you can't move your own local, why should you be here, having a major say-so for everyone else? You needed to represent a body to have some say. But I think, what we were trying to do was lead by example and get out there and act in a principled way and talk about the issues that needed to be talked about and show how you could organize working class folks into the movement like this. And that by itself creates a challenge for the rest of the labor movement, that they either have to catch up with that or get left behind.
Great, thanks, Carl. And did I see, Howard, did I see your hand? Then we can come back to Jenny again.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, it wasn't, of course, an accident that a lot of the unions that I got on board and were active were very progressive unions and did value democracy in their unions, and they were setting the pace that way too. And in thinking in the future, I would argue, you'd have to have a critical mass of unions that are moving in that direction. As Carl perfectly said, you don't want to make that a condition for being part of it. But if you don't have that, it's probably not going to move that way. And actually, those people probably those unions wouldn't be interested in the Labor Party in the first place. So that's all.
Okay, Jenny?
Just a small structural point that I think is important. Unions couldn't just give money and then have a say in the Labor Party. They had to actually recruit members, a certain percentage of members, to be dues-paying members of the Labor Party in order to have, say, a seat on the National Council.
Any other comments on that? Okay, go ahead, Mark.
This just one addition. Some of the unions actually instituted Labor Party checkoff dues provisions in their contracts. So some locals, and I think some UE locals were part of this, Carl, would actually, members would have $1 a week taken out of their paycheck, just like union dues are taken out of your paycheck, and it would be sent to the Labor Party. So we had a few thousand members who joined up, as direct kind of payroll checkoff members. And that was a campaign that some unions would embrace as we, talked about internal campaigns. You'd have, let's go out and sign up 100 new dues checkoff members in the Labor Party and stuff. So.
And okay, go ahead, Jenny. Sorry.
Yeah, and I'll say another thing. We had this this curriculum, Corporate Power and the American Dream, which we taught on a cross-union basis in Gainesville, Florida, and it was a way. It was a way to teach people some of the things that lead us up to the Labor Party program to solve our problems, right? So, but it was also a way to get union activists much more engaged in these larger economic questions, go back and talk to their friends, talk to their coworkers about the Labor Party. So in that sense, it was also building up a little bit within, and Florida at the time and still has a very weak labor movement. And, the carpenters were hosted all this stuff and the IBEW. But so in that way, it was already spreading ideas within locals, not explicitly to say we're going to make your union better, but to make activists feel like, oh, there's something beyond just what we're doing right now that we can look forward to and start building.
I think I want to move on now to ask a question that is, I think, of great interest probably to a lot of people, and certainly I know certainly eventful in the history of the Labor Party, in terms of the challenges of balancing, traditional economic demands with race, social, cultural, international issues. And of course, I'm thinking here about the Iraq War, the abortion issue, in the Clinton era, the question of welfare and workfare programs. How did you go about balancing those issues and accommodating them? Go ahead, Jenny.
Well, I can talk a little bit about the workfare and also the abortion stuff. This was a case where I think the conflict worked out just as it should have been. At the founding convention, there were two heavily Catholic unions, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee and a bakers local, who threatened to walk out in response to the abortion language that was in the program. The program committee met with them. There was a lot of tense back and forth, shuttling of documents, suggestions. In the end, that we worked out language that was still for abortion, unimpeded access to a full range of family planning and reproductive services for men and women, including the right to continue or terminate a pregnancy. And that was actually a compromise language, and it worked out. And I'm for using the word abortion when you mean abortion. I wrote a whole book about the abortion struggle, but in this case, that compromise held and the program was passed and the unions all stayed there. And I think it's a good example of what happens when a group in your coalition has a minority view, but people are really focused on the value of unity and the value of working things out, genuinely, not grandstanding, trying to prove how radical and correct they are, but taking into account the larger goals and the difficulty of bringing together workers with differing views into the kind of organization that it's going to take to win. And it can't be about putting people through litmus tests. We just won't have agreement on every issue, and we're not going to have the time to get there. So, sometimes you can convince people, sometimes you can't. So the Labor Party was an effort to unite around the deep and frankly really neglected issues to do with class power, and we had agreement on those. Those were not problems. And then to work out the areas where we had disagreement through a genuinely democratic process. And unions, even the ones that aren't great, do teach people to work together even when they disagree on things. And it's something I think the left could learn a lot from unions. But I think the other part that people are asking when they talk about abortion and these other things is they're really asking, well, aren't unions sexist? Isn't the Labor Party not going to be any use for women? And my answer is that we were able to make some provisional advances in feminism in the 1960s without really directly confronting corporate power. And they were significant, but we've long since hit a wall and we are going backwards because we have failed to deal with the corporate dictatorship that rules our lives. So you can hashtag Me Too all you want, but as long as you're still going to work where the boss has power over your economic survival, sexual harassment is going to flourish. So we need the power to make that stop. And the way you do that is you have either full employment or a national health care or a union where you can make it stop. So I think this is a time for feminists to unite with everyone else who's making this question of corporate power central. And that's basically working class organizations. The only way we're going to win things that we need as people and be able to get moving forward again, even on specifically feminist demands. On workfare, this was an easy one to explain to union members if you approach it right. Do you want somebody forced to work for sub-minimum wage, often replacing a union public worker? Or do you want to have a fully funded public sector that would hire unemployed people into union jobs? And the Labor Party did a paper on what was going on, but basically the short answer was that our bigger program was all about full employment, the right to a job at a living wage. And until you have the right to a job, someone's going to be unemployed. So what's the labor movement approach to that? It's jobs for all, which, by the way, also has the effect of creating a floor and taking away the sting of losing your job so you can fight for better conditions. Same thing with universal health care, obviously. If you take the coercion out of it, disconnect it from the job, everybody has it, then you have more power on the job just by nature of that. So this was a basic argument that there are things you can't win on the job as a union that have to be fought in the political arena. And if we won them, they would give us more power.
Howard, did you want to come in for a brief comment on that, and then we can kind of move on?
I think that was excellent, Jenny. I just wanted to share a little bit about what happened with the abortion issue. This was at the last hour. We had developed that language. California nurses had worked on that. And at the last hour, the night before the convention, Valdemar Velasquez of the Farm Labor Organizing Committee says he wants to meet with us, the program committee, and he tells us that if you have that plank on abortion in there, they're walking out. He has devout Catholics. I didn't remember that the bakers were involved too, and that why are we putting that in there? That's not a labor issue. Why is that in the program in the first place? And it's so divisive. And if you take it out, there won't be any problem. And that was his point. And we said, we said, Valdemar, wait a minute. If we took that out, half the people in that convention, a lot of the women would be furious with us. So don't think that taking it out means there's no controversy. That's not right. And we said, most of the women in this party believe that, and men too believe that that is a very important right, and we can't give that up. Someone, I don't remember who, came up with the idea, well, let's not use the word abortion. If we use the phrase that Jenny mentioned, access to the full range of reproductive services, will you be able to convince your members to stay? And he thought about it because he didn't want to leave. He really wanted to be a part of this, and we wanted very much for them to be there because we needed diversity in that Labor Party to begin with. That's very important. And so he came back an hour later and he said, "We're in." And it was like, oh my God. And, you know, there were some feminists. Joanne Webazewski wrote an article in The Nation lambasting us for being to the right of the Democratic Party because we didn't have that word in there. But it, as Jenny said, it was the right solution and it made sense to people. And as Jane Slaughter said, don't we want people in the party who aren't necessarily in favor of abortion? Do we want to exclude all those people in our party? And we don't want to do that. There are differences that Jenny explained very well.
There's a famous Martin Luther King quote, "If you're not uncomfortable, your coalition isn't broad enough," which I always like to come back to. Okay, let's turn now to the question of the Democratic Party and electoral strategy, something that I think is probably on a lot of people's minds, given the catastrophe that we just experienced and are continuing to experience. What was it about that moment when the Labor Party was launched and where the Democratic Party in particular was at that made it feel necessary to launch a different party? And do you see a parallel today? Now, I know you guys touched on this kind of in the introduction, but I'm thinking here also, or we were thinking when we were crafting the questions about the Jesse Jackson campaigns, the disillusionment with working class participation, Democratic Party elections in general. How did that factor into the decision to launch a party at that particular moment? Go ahead, Mark.
I'm sorry. So a lot of people involved in the Labor Party project had been involved in Jesse Jackson's 2 election campaigns, seen how the party maneuvered to, marginalize those issues and other primary challenges. I mean, the 1992 primaries, I don't remember, they 12 or 13 different candidates came in there, and they had seen that the Democratic Party was unified around this neoliberal anti-worker marginalization approach, and they just they didn't see that it was possible to move it. And I think they also learned through the Jackson campaigns and some of these other sort of inside the party experiences that sort of trying to intervene within the Democratic Party electorally has a very limited value. It's important to do, because there's no other way to intervene electorally. You have to be there, but it never leaves anything in its wake. You're always playing defense. You're always responding to the latest outrage. You're not really building a permanent structure that can, supplant or transform, those parties into true working class parties. So they were really ready to try something new.
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, and I would say it had to do with the nature of the changes taking place in the labor movement. I mean, if you look at the trajectory, obviously in the 30s and in the first part of the 40s, we had a militant, class-conscious labor movement, and the McCarthy era and the Cold War was about smashing that and destroying that. And unfortunately, a large section of the labor leadership, gleefully took part in that and became, labor statesmen, or as some would call them, labor's capital's lieutenants in labor, and led us down the road to the point we were a paper tiger that Reagan was able to blow over in the 80s. But what had happened in the late 60s and early 70s, there was actually an upsurge with a lot of rank and file activity in the labor movement because of basically based on all of the fights that were taking place, and whether it was the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. Those folks had become like shop floor leaders in the late 60s, early 70s. And by later in the 80s, they were starting to come into leadership in some of the unions. And so you had that base there that could then when we got into the 90s, and it's why you were seeing the developments like TDU being able to grab power for a short period in the Teamsters, and other folks coming up in other unions. So folks were there in enough different unions that we had a critical mass to talk about these things, combined with the Democrats showing their total bankruptcy in terms of any expectation that they're actually serving the needs of the working class. And I'd argue that we're sort of at a similar point again now. I don't think there's anybody, I mean, even in the highest ranks of labor, there's been discussion that, what the Democrats have done is, and the kind of campaign they ran and the candidates are choosing, and what people have seen in terms of the marginalization of Bernie, just the same way it was done to Jesse, it's opened more eyes here to how the Democratic Party just can't solve our problems for us, and we've got to solve it ourselves. Combined with, most union leaders have been really banging their head about against, what can we do on behalf of our members, and being driven into having to take stronger and stronger positions. And then this whole generation that's come into the labor movement over the last 20 years. I mean, there's a reason why everybody under 45 is so pro-union. It's because they've been a victim of an economy that has been on a continual downward slide in terms of taking care of the economic needs of working people. And those folks are now playing a real role all through the labor movement and are in position to get that kind of momentum again now. So I'm actually optimistic. I know we'll talk more later about how we can maybe move some things forward and what lessons we can take, but I think that's a crucial piece.
So just picking up on that, I mean, why didn't the Labor Party run candidates in the Democratic Party primaries? And would you see it differently now in the context of Bernie having happened in the squad, et cetera? What were the experiences with ballot issues, and what was the strategic thinking around that?
So I was on the electoral committee, so I should probably talk about that, and spent a lot of long hours and a lot of meetings. There was a tension there. And frankly, Tony Mazzacchi's vision from the beginning was, we've got to build a movement before we can be an electoral organization. But there were others who definitely wanted to move towards elections quickly. But there was this movement concept was there. You've got to build a working class movement, congressional district by congressional district, or whatever the area was. And that meant getting a good number of unions on board who are in that area. So you had some density there amongst the labor movement, and then going out and actually doing on the ground organizing, making use of the issues that we would be running on at some point. So that you had an actual base there that would support you if you got into office, and then you would come under attack by capital. Well, you better have some people who are going to have your back, or you're not going to be able to stand up to it, was the thinking. And that meant, pretty much by definition, we're going to be building this separate organization, this separate party. And that if we tried to do it within the Democratic Party, we were going to get subsumed by all of the corruption and poison that runs through the Democratic Party, and it overtakes anybody who has tried to do that from within. And so I think that was the thinking there. I will say, we made very strict criteria. If you look through that electoral statement, before you could actually run, we were concerned that there would be like a rump group of people who declared themselves the Labor Party in an area, and they had no real labor support or anything, and all of a sudden they're running candidates who are marginal and would be basically an embarrassment to us, because they would, instead of demonstrating we can do this, they would be demonstrating we can't do this, right? We didn't want to be the Green Party. But we made that so stringent that it essentially constricted us from ever running candidates during that period. And the moment passed. And, because of the changes in the economy, changes in the labor movement, changes in the fact that, George Bush II came into office, and 9/11 happened, and there were a whole series of things, although I would argue changes in the labor movement maybe were the most important piece of it. And so the moment passed, and so we never were able to do proof of concept. Having it to do over again, if I was sitting on that electoral committee again, I would probably say, let's find a way to make this, let's find a couple places to really concentrate on and make it work and put all our resources there and do a proof of concept so that others will pick up on it. We get other unions on board, but we didn't have that. And the other thing we didn't have then, that I would hope we could have now if we tried something again, we didn't have any large national unions that could have brought in substantially more resources. And if we could have made that breakthrough, it might have made a difference too in terms of what we could have done electorally.
Howard?
That issue of resources, we need to really underline that, because a lot of people don't realize what that meant to us. You know, at one point the AFL-CIO put up 65 million to, I guess, reelect Clinton. I'm not remembering when it was, but we were thinking to ourselves, you know, if we had 1 million of that 65, if you would just, you know, do that, keep doing your Democratic Party work and give us that million a year, what we could do with that. We had three national organizers for the whole country trying to organize the Labor Party full time. Everyone else was doing it above their job, you know, their full-time jobs. And it was, you know, it was very, very difficult. If we had some serious resources, which would come from some bigger unions, that would have been enormously helpful to us. But we didn't get that. You know, when we were close, you know, who knows what could have happened if Ron Kerry didn't get bounced out of the Teamsters at that moment. There's a good chance he might have moved in our direction. Having the Teamsters would have been enormously important, but it didn't go that way. I agree with you, Carl, that it was that problem that really put the kibosh on our efforts.
Jenny?
Yeah, I mean, I agree absolutely, Howard. And there was this feeling of the window closing, basically because the labor movement had this uptick, which we thought was going to continue, and it did not continue, and they were back to kicking our asses again. So that's the basic underlying problem that, you know, that we were facing. But the concept of a Labor Party was explicitly, we're not going to run on the Democratic Party line. We're not going to run fusion candidates. They're going to be our own candidates. We're going to select them by convention.
Sorry, Jenny, could you just explain what is a fusion candidate? Because that's, I think, important in terms of getting at the differences with the Working Families Party, which I also wanted to ask about. So maybe just break that down as well for people who might not be familiar.
Sure. So there are a few states, and New York is one of them, where we have a Working Families Party, where you can put the Democratic candidate on your line, and people can vote on your line instead of on the Democratic line, and you can build your party that way, theoretically. And then at some point you can run other people. That's the theory, and it has, I think, been proven to not work out too well. The problem, of course, with our whole idea is that you can't, it's not, as Michael Knukin pointed out recently in an article where he says political parties are illegal in the United States. You can't select your candidates by primary, by convention anymore. That's just not a thing. That's legal in nearly any state or nearly any office. So the only way that you can actually have control of and have party discipline, which we see the Democratic Party doesn't have party discipline, for example, and neither do the Republicans, is by having a big enough machine that you can guarantee that your candidate is the one who is selected in the primary, and then which is kind of like the model that DSA is using, right, in New York. We have enough of a canvassing operations and support and fundraising, and we have the unified fundraising mechanism that we can say, okay, we're endorsing this candidate and we're putting this power behind them, and we can elect them. So and then we have the advantage in New York City that it's basically a one party's operation. Everything is decided in the primary, which takes away this sort of spoiler issue. So so we're in a somewhat of a different situation, but this whole dream that we could have a party that would have its own candidates that would be selected by convention that we could unselect, that's actually not legal within the electoral system that we have now. So I'm not against having a party entity. But we have to be aware of like what water we're swimming in when we think about this and get to sort of the interesting issues around that. And I think in New York, the way that we've dealt with that is to have, you know, basically DSA is an electoral machine, small but vigorous. It has several socialists in office. They have a group called Socialists in Office that you know, and there are problems with all of these things, but that I think is the best model, that caucus together and make plans together and are not, you know, and are hated by the Democratic Party, obviously. But they ran on Democratic Party lines. You know, this is, I think Seth Ackerman in his article in Jacobin a few years ago, Blueprint for a New Party, was right that we should think about electoral politics in the US as being essentially authoritarian. We don't actually have parties or democracy in the sense that I think a lot of people think we do. And so you have to really basically run your candidates however you can on the Democratic Party line, if it's an independent, if it, you know, so there are a lot of issues around that. But with the Labor Party, the concept was to be entirely independent and not cooperate with the Democrats.
Mark, did you want to come in, and if you can, maybe address the specific, you know, the organizing approach to politics that you were discussing earlier in the context of what you want to say?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that had we been part of a labor movement that was organizing 1 million new workers a year, and had we been able to build, you know, be part of a movement and build our density within that movement, we would have figured out how to do this. And, you know, I have to say, kind of in retrospect, it's always easy to see things so clearly in the rear view mirror. It probably was a mistake to launch the party before we had a greater density and before, you know, we understood what shape this union revival was going to take. We probably should have kept a looser Labor Party advocate structure, maybe not overpromise to people what a party ought to be doing. But, you know, I think, you know, within that structure, I mean, there's two things that I think it's important to think about proactively. I mean, we could talk about all the debates we had in basements in 1998 about this stuff, but we ought to really be using this discussion to think about how the hell are we going to deal with the fact that the working class has abandoned the Democratic Party or is in the process of abandoning the Democratic Party. And because there's no other alternatives, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are flocking to this right-wing populist vision that a strong man, it's almost always a man, not always, but almost always a man, can intervene on your behalf and win things that you can no longer win through collective action. And, you know, how the hell are we going to do that in that context? I mean, that's really the challenge. And I think, you know, one thing we learned in the Labor Party was it's really hard for people who are on the front lines battling the bosses every day to think about how to strategically disengage from the Democratic Party while they're building an alternative, because it's like you're taking off, you're laying down whatever few shields and weapons you have, and they're forging the new ones over there, but the bosses are coming right at you. And what are you going to do? And so that's really, that's the quandary we're in. And, you know, this is, you know, some of these people were just suck ass Democratic Party followers who would do whatever Bill Clinton told them to do. But a lot of these people who were on different sides of these debates were really struggling with, what the hell am I going to do? You know, I represent hospital workers in New York City, and the goddamn governor determines the Medicaid reimbursement rate. And if I don't endorse him, he's going to screw 100,000 of my members in the next budget cycle. I mean, how do you figure that stuff out? And that's really the challenge that we have to do. And that goes into sort of this organizing approach to politics, which is, you know, politics is about power, and you have to build power in order to engage in politics. And you have to think about what makes, you know, workers stronger, but you also have to have an analysis that takes you beyond, you know, the immediate day-to-day stuff. And that's, you know, some unions were able to do that. I mean, my union, you know, in this moment, you know, I think really understood that you could do, you know, walk and chew gum at the same time, but it's hard to do when you're enmeshed in these fights and these battles.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mark. And that actually segues us beautifully into the next kind of set of issues I'd like to, we thought we'd bring up, which is questions of broader lessons and takeaways for the present moment. So obviously, you know, it's apparent that the Labor Party ran into various impasses. And so I'd be curious to hear, you know, your assessment of, was a different outcome possible, or was it just inevitable the way that things went? Could things have been done differently? Could they have turned out differently, or was it just the conditions were not right, and the project was bound to end up as it did? I know it's not an easy one to answer, but I'd be curious to hear your assessments.
Well,
go ahead, Howard.
Going back to what we were talking about before, it's easy to look back and say, oh, you know, we should have done this or that. We couldn't tell what was going to happen. We thought Andy Stern was going to be more progressive than he ended up being, and that maybe the SEIU would come on board. That would have been incredible. Now I'm very excited about what's happening in the UAW, because if that was happening, we would have really had something, as Carl was saying, but we didn't know. And if had we waited, actually, things were going to get worse. So we probably, and I think, you know, what Mark said is probably right. We would have had to fall back to being the LPA and continuing that work, which wouldn't have been the end of the ball game either. But you just don't know. You gotta, and it looked like a good moment to try this, and we were close. We were close. So, but again, you know, if we were going to try something again, you know, I would probably say we should go slow and careful and make sure we get that critical mass of progressive unions that really want to support us seriously, not just give us a few $1,000s once in a while like Andy Stern did, but really go to bat for us and start putting up some resources. Then we can really start doing something. That doesn't mean we can't do anything else. I think, you know, in Mark and Catherine's piece, which I recommend people read, that's in that packet, they talk about doing other things like working for single payer healthcare and other kinds of issue campaigns that can still bring up class politics and excite people without having to run candidates immediately. I'm not opposed, by the way, under certain circumstances, Carl. I wouldn't, you know, I think, you know, an experiment here or there, if you really had a strong base, would be worth doing. But
so I'd be happy to engage that so first, starting with your first question, was a different outcome possible in the 90s? Probably not. And the fact that, you know, I said in retrospect, we should have moved faster, and Mark said in retrospect, we should have moved slower. I think that right there tells you, yeah, we didn't really have a path, right? But I wanna take on Howard's point that we need to patiently build right now. I would argue, we can't afford to be too patient because of what we're facing. And B, because of the changes that have occurred now, because such a larger section of the working class has deserted the Democratic Party. But the Republican Party that's in charge right now, we know is not actually going to deliver for those the great bulk of the folks who voted for them, especially those from the working class. There's going to be new possibilities here that we need to look at how we can take advantage of. And the militancy in the younger generation, we can't afford to not harness that. It would be, I would argue, it would be a crime against working class struggle for us not to figure out how to take advantage of that. I mean, it's even, it's in, I just saw a recent piece. I think there's a logic to that. Part of the reason that the tech bros have gotten all of a sudden so right wing and so authoritarian is because their own staff, and these are folks, all at all levels, up to very highly educated folks, are revolting against them and revolting against this corporate culture. So we've got to figure out a way to take advantage of that. And then we have some examples already. We have a proof of concept. Dan Osborne ran in Nebraska on a relative shoestring, especially in terms of what was developed organization there beforehand. He had led a strike. That's and he was standing up on a very populist working class agenda. More of a left populist, not a whole left. Not the whole set of left ideas, but certainly the economic pieces, and came close to knocking off a very well-funded incumbent Republican senator, because the reason the areas that are quote unquote red, that are very heavily Republican, are to that extent is because the labor movement got wiped out in those areas by NAFTA. All of the mid-sized factories that were in those areas are all gone, and that was the unions. And so all that's left generally are right-wing churches. But that doesn't mean the people who live there aren't still working class folks and farmers and others who need a different solution than what's being foisted on them. So if we could get some unions together, and look, a Labor Party is not of some sort, is not going to be able to be built just on the labor union movement. There's no way. We don't represent enough people. There's not enough mass. But we are the organized part of the working class and have some resources and have some organization, and perhaps could go out and do some proof of concept races in some places. And I would argue legislative races, not executive, because in any place where we can win a mayor's seat, probably we're going to face either a capital strike or the ruling class has already dumped that area into the waste bin anyway, and you're not going to be able to do what you need to do. But if we could start winning a bunch of legislative seats and congressional seats and other things, it could not only perhaps begin to form the basis of putting something together, but it could also help turn the tide in terms of what's the narrative in this country about where the politics are at. Because if you look at the issues, we still have the great bulk of the American people behind us on every issue that matters, and that's what we got to find a way to harness. What exactly that looks like, I don't know, but it's a discussion we need to have, and it needs to be built on what did we learn in the 90s. I would also say, I think we could combine doing that in areas where the Democrats have basically ceded the ground totally, and then combine it with maybe running some very hard labor, anti-Democratic Party establishment, anti-corporate Democrat folks in very base, like urban areas, et cetera, with an understanding these folks are, they're running within the Democratic Party because in that area, there really is no party. It's a one-party state, right? There's no, the election is the Democratic primary. So I'm not averse to thinking maybe we elect some people in those areas and then eventually kind of merge everything together into a new formation when we've got enough strength. The problem here, and that we'd have to figure out, is how do you hold people accountable if you get them elected and it's not in some kind of structure? And I think that's something that requires a lot of thought. And it may be that if we do try to run folks not as either Democrats or Republicans in some of these quote unquote red areas, if there's some way to have some kind of labor moniker on them, something that attaches them to something bigger than themselves, maybe we can do something. But I'm concerned about waiting too long.
I can't argue against that. We're in trouble.
Did you say me?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Jenny and then Mark. Go ahead, Jenny.
Slippery. So, so I in the packet that you all got, there's a long article by Mark and Adolf Reed, about, which was in the Socialist Register, which is it's a very dense and great article, in my opinion. And they basically say there's no left expression, and then about 4 months later the Bernie thing happens, and it's like, so I think one thing that we don't want to have happen is for you all to learn that from our experience that you can't do this. We don't want that to be the lesson that is here. There's always some kind of possibilities we have to be alert to, and I used to run into people who had been at the struggle for winning national health care for 30 years, who the lesson that they got from it is that we can't win. And so you always have to watch out for those folks.
Go ahead, Mark. You're muted, I think.
There, Howard, I did it too. So
We've
look,
all done it.
as the last national organizer of the Labor Party, I thought a lot about why we had to stop and what we maybe could have done differently. And, I'm convinced, as everybody else, that, we just ran out of history, that the tables turned, and, whatever brilliant ideas we might have come up with, we probably couldn't have outrun the early 2000s and the impact that they had. But I'm also convinced that we are at another crossroads right now, both because of the right-wing authoritarian takeover of the U.S. government, and because of this, incredible search and yearning for a party that speaks on behalf of working people. So we got to figure this stuff out, folks, and we've got to, whatever we can take and learn from the history of the Labor Party is gold right now for where we have to be. But, I would say, I think that there's a lot of creative things we can do around electoral politics, and we ought to start trying them. I mean, in Chicago, Carl, there's all kinds of kind of union-oriented caucuses and organizations and stuff that are pushing politics in really interesting ways. And in other places like that with high union density, I think there maybe needs to be more of a collaborative sharing of experiences and perspectives and stuff on that. The rise of independent candidacies like Osborne in Nebraska are very, very interesting and unique. I think we need to take a longer view on that. We'll see where they go and how it's possible. One thing you do when you run a good campaign like that is you do wake up the Democratic Party, who, maybe won't be caught sleeping the next time. And so, there's a lot of things there, but, I think that was a very much of a breakthrough campaign. Another area that I think there's huge potential in is issue campaigns. Almost every state that's ever had a referendum on raising the minimum wage has raised the minimum wage, has defended the women's rights to abortion and all of these other issues. And so we can, begin to engage people perhaps around issue orientation. And so these are all kinds of things we need to be thinking about and exploring right now. But we also just have to constantly, I think, understand that party building is really much more than just electoralism. And that's, that's the problem that we've had, particularly in this country. Because Jenny touched, on some of the structural reasons for that, actually, that, we really ought to think about why is it so much different to try to build a Labor Party in the US versus Australia and other parliamentary systems and all of that kind of stuff. How do you hold people accountable? So, it's a lot more than just electoralism. And, in many cases, overemphasis on the next election is exactly what we don't need to think about how we're going to build independent working class politics. And, you know, we need to think about how we can continue to move through these electoral cycles, which seem to get shorter and shorter because they start up right after the last one ends. And in the midst of all that, kind of bring together a disoriented and demoralized working class that has to be at the center of our politics, and stop talking to each other about this stuff and start talking to working people about what issues bring them to action, and what issues they're passionate about, and how we can give articulation to that in politics. So that's really our essential task. And then, you know, all of the other things kind of fit in as kind of tactical things. I absolutely believe that, you know, we're not going to announce the relaunching of the Labor Party effort at this point. It's not going to be a productive moment, you know, but I do believe that there's a lot to learn from the history here, and other histories too that we've had. Bernie's campaigns are incredibly informative. And then, you know, even things like the Red for Ed movements that swept the country a few years back, you know, showing a very kind of a much more horizontal way of organizing that, you know, had, you know, both surprising immediate success, and then, you know, problems over, you know, in terms of sustaining that success. Those are the kind of things that we need to study and learn from too.
Thanks, Mark. So I think I saw Howard and then Carl.
No, I'm good.
No. Okay, go ahead, Carl.
Thanks. So taking off from where Mark left off. So yes, whatever we're doing in terms of party building, we have to be thinking for the long term, not just the very next election. And what that's really about is building class consciousness. So that, and really that was what the Labor Party platform was about in taking out the issue campaigns in the districts, is getting people to understand which side they're on, and why the solution to their problems was to take away corporate power and build worker power, whether it was through unions or at the ballot box or wherever else. So, you know, when I talk about trying to find some ways to start experimenting with running some candidates here and there, it needs to be on the basis of issues that are going to raise up people's class consciousness, not ignore the class issues. They've got to be really centered there and be very sharp anti-corporate campaigns. Mark also mentioned both Bernie and the Red for Ed stuff. So what we have now that we did not have in the 1990s is a understanding of distributed organizing. We had it in the 1930s. That labor movement was organized, a lot of it, by the workers themselves. And not entirely, but big pieces of it. Certainly it's the way my union, UE, was organized. And that got lost over the generations, and not by accident, I'd say on purpose, because workers who organize themselves retain that power, and it's a threat to the status quo of the higher ups in the union. And the same with the Democratic Party. So Bernie showed this distributing organizing model for the Democratic Party. I don't think the Democratic Party is going to want to use it in the same way, because, again, you're liberating people to run their own lives. And in fact, a good piece of why we would want to do it amongst working people is because it allows them to start to understand they can run society. They don't have to have some overlords doing it for them. They can take things on and take things over and pull the levers themselves. I mean, and that's UE's approach to union organizing, and a few other unions do it too. But it does take, you know, it takes the leap of faith that if we show workers who are organizing how to run their own unions, they're going to want to continue to build this union and do it jointly with the folks who are already here and been building it. They're not a threat. They're the future, right? Most unions don't have that outlook, unfortunately. Some of them are moving towards it a little bit more. That's the kind of electoral work I think we need to be doing, and it's what Bernie showed can succeed. And that's why I do think, you know, things can change rapidly if we can figure out how to make that happen. And if thousands of people in a congressional district have been involved in building their own campaign, that can, if we're smart about it, create a way to force accountability, because now you've got this organization of real people who are there. Exactly what that looks like, I don't pretend to know the answer. We've got to get together and figure these things out, though, and try them.
Howard?
Don't disagree with that at all, Carl. I just, as the co-chair of the New York Labor Party, I got a little bit of a different perspective on that one issue, and I just would urge people, and I think DSA people have had a little taste of what can happen if you have mostly left folks who have various acts to grind and don't have a mass base that they're representing. It can get very dicey and destructive and an enormous waste of resources. And so, we had people that were absolutely dedicated to the Labor Party. And as soon as it fell apart, one of them ran for governor under the Green Party. And it was then the politics came out clearly. Okay, that's what you wanted to do. You have to have that working class base before we can work on that experimentation, that can happen in some districts, in some areas where you can test, as you said, test the concept. I just want to urge making sure we do that, and then we do that hard organizing work of going door to door, which Tony was always harping on. Go door to door, go and talk to people, whatever it is. Don't just, especially now that we have the internet and we tend to think that's a substitute for real organizing work. We've got to do that hard work to build that base. And then maybe we'll have something.
I think that's a great note to wrap up on. I just want to thank our sponsors one more time, the DSA National Labor Commission, the Rank and File Project, UAW Region 9A, the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America, and the Socialist Register, as well as our panelists, Carl Rosen, Jenny Brown, Howard Botwinick, Mark Dudzic. I'm Stephen Marr. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. It was a really tremendous discussion. We'll be in touch over email about possible future events and to follow up in general. I hope everybody found it as enjoyable as I did.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Steve, for organizing it, and everyone else that was involved.
Thank you. This was a fun discussion.
Yep. Solidarity.
Solidarity.
Bye, everyone.